New World Aeternum is right around the corner, and whenever it launches, you're going to be able to enjoy a wide variety of fun activities, including exploring the ever beautiful world of Aeternum, engaging in an immersive story, taking part in an abundance of PvP activities, enjoying a lot of different life skills, and of course, there is a whole lot of PvE to take part in. This just scratches the surface of what there is to enjoy in New World Aeternum, but for this video, we'll be focusing on the PvE aspects of the game. Whenever you wash up on the shores of Aeternum, you're going to be able to experience a ton of fun and engaging PvE content that ranges from open world encounters, PvE trials, expeditions, mutated expeditions, and a whole lot more. But before we dive too deep into the PvE specifics, I would like to first thank Amazon Games for sponsoring this video. Aeternum is a very mysterious island with a lot of different creatures living there, and whenever you wash up on the shores, you're going to encounter a ton of different enemy types. These enemies are broken down into several different groups that include the Lost, the Corrupted, the Angry Earth, the Varangians, the Beasts, and the Ancients. Within each of these enemy groups, there's a large variety of different enemy types that you're going to encounter, each with their own unique abilities and attacks. As you encounter these enemies more and more, you're going to begin to learn their attack patterns and their movement style. This is going to help you dodge, block, and attack when necessary so that you can have a much easier time defeating these enemies. What's also unique about each enemy group is that they all have different weaknesses. This means that you can properly prepare your loadout when you're encountering different types of enemies in the game. This is going to be very useful when you begin to do the harder content in the game, like expeditions, and then of course their mutated versions. Expeditions are essentially instanced dungeons in a New World Aeternum. These are meant for a group of 5 players to explore and combat their way through challenging encounters that include puzzles, named enemies, and bosses with unique mechanics. The named enemies within each expedition feature buffs, health, and damage increases. The bosses that you're going to encounter take place within a locked arena in the expedition, and each boss for every single expedition has their own set of unique mechanics. Players are going to need to learn these mechanics and then work together in order to complete the expedition. Of course, whenever you complete the expedition, you are going to be rewarded with some specialized rewards. There's currently 13 different expeditions in the game, each with their own unique mechanics and rewards. You're going to encounter some of them early on in your adventures and some much later. However, the early game expeditions remain relevant in the end game due to the mutation feature that New World Aeternum has. Each expedition in the game contains a particular enemy group or groups. For example, the Garden of Genesis is filled with Angry Earth enemies, Barnacles and Black Powder is filled with the Lost, and Tempest Heart is filled with Corrupted enemies. This means if you find yourself in an expedition filled with Angry Earth enemies like the Garden of Genesis, you'll want to consider utilizing weapons and damage types that the Angry Earth are weak to. A quick rundown of the enemy weaknesses in the game are as follows. Ancients are weak to strike, void, and lightning damage. Corrupted are weak to thrust, nature, and arcane. Angry Earth are weak to slash and fire. The Lost are weak to strike, ice, and nature. Varangians are weak to slash, and Beasts are weak to thrust damage. So knowing this information is going to help you increase your damage output and plan accordingly for each expedition that you run. You can easily view the type of damage a particular weapon does by opening your weapon mastery menu and hovering over a particular weapon. For example, the sword deals slash damage, the spear deals thrust damage, the hammer deals strike damage, and so on. Each weapon also scales off of a particular attribute or set of attributes. It's incredibly important that you invest your points into the correct attributes. Doing so will increase the amount of damage you deal by a very significant amount. If you invest in the wrong attributes, then your damage will be very low. However, don't worry if you make a mistake or want to switch weapons, because you can always respec your attribute points whenever you want. You can see which weapon scales off of which attribute by clicking on a particular weapon in your weapon mastery menu. You can further enhance your build for PvE with the use of gems. There are gems that you can obtain and slot into your weapons and armor that will have different effects based on the gem you use. Some gems will convert a percentage of your damage dealt into elemental type damage. For example, you could slot a ruby into your weapon and gain the ignited effect. This would convert 50% of your damage dealt with your weapon into fire damage. There are also gems such as a Carnelian gem that are very role specific. If you're planning on being the tank for your group, you will need to slot these gems into your weapons in order to activate your taunting abilities. This will then generate more threat from the enemies you're fighting, helping you maintain aggro as the tank. However, Carnelians also have an alternative use outside of the tank role. You can slot these gems into your armor to reduce the generation of threat. This will make it less likely that the enemies within the expedition will attack you, which will allow their aggro to remain on the tank. In addition to the types of damage you're going to deal, there are also other considerations to make whenever you're putting together a PvE build or coordinating with your group for build synergies. For example, there are debuffs that you'll want to apply to your target no matter what their vulnerabilities are. Two of the main debuffs you'll want to apply in PvE are called Rend and Weaken. Rend reduces the damage absorption of your target, making them a whole lot easier to take down, and Weaken reduces the attack damage of your target, which will greatly increase yours and your group's survivability because the enemy will be dealing much less damage whenever they are weakened. There are different weapons that excel at applying different debuffs. The spear is an excellent choice for PvE and something you will definitely want to have in your group because the spear applies both Rend and Weaken with its abilities, and it can dish out a good amount of damage. There are other options as well and other weapons that are super valuable to your group. The Great Axe, for example, excels at grouping enemies together with its ability called Gravity Well. This can be a huge benefit when you're engaging in PvE activities, and grouping enemies together makes it much easier for you and your group to quickly take them down. All of these are things to consider whenever you're putting together a PvE build. Once you have your foundations of a build together and you progress into the end game, you're going to want to start doing the mutated versions of the expeditions for much better loot. Mutated versions of the expeditions are much more difficult end game versions of their normal counterparts. Mutations scale up the level of the enemies for the end game, and they add mutations that increase the difficulty. There are 3 mutated expeditions at a time, and the expeditions that are mutated rotate every week. There are 3 difficulty levels of mutations, and level 1 is the easiest, with level 3 being the hardest version of the mutated expeditions. Difficulty 1 mutations include a set of elemental mutations. Difficulty level 2 includes what's called promotions that further enhances the difficulty level, and level 3 mutations add curses on top of the elemental mutations and promotions. For example, an elemental mutation could be what's called Eternal. When an expedition has this particular mutation, there would be a chance of the enemies having the following perks. On death, enemies cast a spell granting other enemies void empowerment. Enemies can apply leech on hit. This would deal 20% base void damage and heal the enemy. Enemies would also apply building stacks of paranoia whenever they get hit. And then at 4 stacks, a void burst would appear at your location that would deal AoE void damage. And then all of the enemies would deal 50% of their damage as void damage. On top of the elemental mutation, a level 2 mutation would also include a promotion. For example, an expedition could have the barbaric promotion that could enhance the enemies with the following buffs. Whenever you get hit, enemies generate fury that would increase their damage dealt, or enemies forego the reduced stamina damage in expeditions and deal increased stamina damage. Also, upon breaking your block, they would apply a bleed. Then, further enhancing the difficulty of a mutation, level 3, the expedition could have the previous 2 mutations as well as a curse. For example, an expedition could have the Frenzied Curse that applies the following effects. Every time you dodge, you would be inflicted with void damage over time. This is called Unstable. This effect can stack up to 3 times, and it cannot be cleansed by player abilities. If the unstable effect expires with 3 stacks active, it will then drop an AoE on the ground, and any player inside of this will take damage over time. And if you enter the effect with stacks of unstable, it's going to consume all of those stacks and then deal damage of 30% of your max HP. So you can see how these mutations definitely begin to enhance the difficulty of all of the expeditions in New World Aeternum. But the mutation effects are not always the same. There are various elemental mutations, promotions, and curses. So in order to complete these mutations, you're going to need to properly be geared and prepared. This means you want to take into consideration the type of elemental, promotion, and curse the expedition has, as well as weaknesses of enemies, debuffs you're going to want to apply, and you'll want to not only slot the appropriate gems for damage, but also the appropriate gems to mitigate the elemental damage of the mutation. For example, slotting amber gems into your armor will give you increased nature damage absorption. This is going to greatly increase your survivability in a mutation that has a nature damage modifier. The bosses in mutated expeditions are much harder as well. On top of you needing to know all of the mechanics, these bosses have a resistance to your rend and weakens, making them less effective. Due to all of these challenges, taking every advantage you can in order to increase your damage and survivability are key. So those are mutations in a nutshell. They're a very engaging PvE activity that you're going to need to be prepared for in order to be successful. But if expeditions and their more difficult counterparts mutations are not for you, don't worry, because there's also a ton of open world PvE activities to enjoy. There are tons of engaging points of interest located around Aeternum, and each of these have a unique setting with different enemies within. There's also plenty of challenging open world named enemies and bosses to defeat. You can choose to take these on solo or put together a large group for these encounters. You can visit places like Mirkgard and Shattered Mountain, Isle of Zurvan in Elysian Wilds, or Castrum Principium in Brimstone Sands for challenging elite enemies, or you can visit the non-elite areas for less of a challenge and still gain some pretty good loot. Also, as you make your way through the main quest line in New World Aeternum, you're going to encounter some soul trials. These are unique and engaging boss fights. You're going to need to defeat these soul trials in order to progress the story. Each of these soul trials have unique mechanics with varying enemy types. If you find yourself struggling to defeat one of these bosses, make sure your attributes are correctly assigned. You want to consider equipping a weapon that deals damage that particular boss is weak to, and you can go beef up your equipment with gems or just simply level up your character to obtain higher gear score gear and then come back whenever you're a little bit stronger. Along with all of the normal PvE activities the game has to offer, there's also plenty of seasonal events that happen throughout the year that introduce new bosses with these events. For example, during the Night Valhalla event, you'll be able to hunt down a very large world boss named Balfazu. Balfazu has a ton of health and unique mechanics. These types of encounters are very group oriented, and you will see a ton of players participating in these events. You simply need to run to the boss spawn to participate in the encounter. You'll be able to take down the world boss multiple times during the event and earn some great loot. And there's several of these events scattered throughout the year. No matter the type of PvE player you are, whether that be solo, more of an explorer, an adventurer, or a hardcore min-maxer, there's going to be a PvE activity that will suit your needs in New World Aeternum. That's going to do it for this one. Thank you guys for watching. We will see you in Aeternum.